Have to sit in the first row, not the back row. But you guys come in.
All right.
He doesn't bite.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate it if you please move up towards the front. We're about to get started for the prospective student session. For the, these, so you're covering this one, right?
Thank you, Lord. Thank you. Okay, just right before you guys go ahead, this is Professor Rashid Kohli. This professor I mentioned earlier. I've taken his class in my second year in business school for the emerging market. Professor is basically going to give you a dive into what the emerging market is and how we teach in business school at Columbia. And we hope you guys make it as dynamic as possible. Really great professor, is really open, so ask any questions that you have and bring your own experience if you do have some and if you relate to any of the topics that I mentioned. So you guys will have this session for another hour, so try to enjoy it and ask as many questions as possible.
Thank you, brother. Good evening to you all. So Arif tells me that you want the classroom discussion. So I figured you give you a real classroom, which means that I'll only ask the questions and you give the answers. That's what we do now. Right? So this is not going to be me standing here talking. It's going to be you, right, engaging in a dialogue, trying to sort of address some questions. So let me give you a little context and background. My name is Rajiv Kohli. I, as you can tell, am originally from India. Came here in the US a long time ago, 1978. And I've been in Columbia the last 20 years. I teach in marketing, and since last year, I have been teaching a course on emerging markets. As you know, the tremendous changes taking place, both in the US and outside. And emerging markets have emerged as sort of the beacon in the last decade or more. They've become prominent in the last decade at least. What's been going on in China has been happening for the last 30 years. What's happened in India has been going on since the early 90s. After Goldman talked about BRICS, it became fashionable, and everyone has heard and talks about BRICS. And now there's a lot of conversation about what the next set of countries are. Some of it is real, some of it is media manufactured. To say, well, the BRICS everyone knows about. Now, what else can we talk about, right? So that's sort of what it is. What we try to do in this course, and I won't bore you much longer, but just give you a headline on this, is the idea is that if you look at opportunities in emerging markets, there are two ways of doing it. One is to look at each country and each market together and say, so what's special about this? Right? If I go into country A or country B, what are the opportunities and how do we structure how we invest or where we invest or which industries we come together? That's sort of been the approach lots of people have followed. The approach we take is that that's too piecemeal. And while it is interesting and useful to think about every market in itself, it is also true that human beings are pretty much identical in the ways in which their lives evolve, whether we happen to live in a developed country or a developing country. The basic human needs and responses are very similar. And therefore, markets go through similar patterns of growth, and similar opportunities arise at similar points in the life of economy of the country is. And so, in order to systematically analyze what opportunities we have, we need to take a broader view than one market at a time. And we say, we look across contexts and across countries and societies, and what can we learn about similar phases of development in certain countries and how they apply to certain other economies. So that sort of is the core idea of what we do in this class. And so I talk a little bit to you about it, but I want to hear from you first. You sort of, those of you who are here, have chosen to sit in this room. So I want to ask you, where do you come from in terms of your thinking about emerging markets? What is interesting in emerging markets? Why would you be interested in emerging markets?
My name is Olu. I'm actually a student here.
Sorry?
My name is Olu.
Olu.
I'm actually a student here.
Okay, good.
So I was wondering, can we ask questions as well?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I guess I should.
No, but I asked you the question.
Yes. Ask you a question first.
Yeah.
Well, emerging markets, of course, is very important just because of globalization right now. I mean, we live in a global village. I mean, we have people from diversity, people from all over the world right here in this space. And the opportunities, the saturation in more advanced economies mean that they need to look to other sources of opportunities, and we need to transfer innovation and just greater cooperation. So just like this economy is currently going through problems. It would be a great idea if we have skilled labor that could move to these emerging markets that have these opportunities, and we can easily transfer which move around.
Yeah. So one is simply pure and simple opportunity. Emerging markets represent potential opportunity. They seem to be growing faster. Emerging markets have slowed down, or developed markets have slowed down. What, by the way, is the difference between 2% growth, and the US has been seeing less than 2% growth in the economy, and 8% growth, or if you believe what numbers we get from China, 10% growth. What's the substantial difference? If you talk about 2% versus 8%, what impact does that have? Roughly speaking, how do you translate that into anything substantial? So, give you an example. How long does it take for an economy to double in size if it's growing at 2% a year? Roughly. Double in size. So the US economy is about 16 trillion. How long will it take for it to double in size and get to 32 trillion if it grows at 2% a year? Long time. 10 years.
Over 10 years.
10 years?
Over 10 years.
Over 10 years. What happens to an economy that's growing at 10%? China is now how much? About 525 trillion, right? Between 5 and 6 trillion. We think bigger than that. If it continues to grow at 10%, how long will it be before it doubles and gets to the size of the US economy? So there's a very simple rule. If you take the number 72 and divide it by the growth rate, that's the number of years it takes to double. And it's an approximate formula. So if you grow at 2% a year, you will double every 36 years. If you grow at 10%, you will double every 7 years. So at the same time that the US economy doubles in size, what will happen to the Chinese economy if each grows at 2% or 10%?
Like grown by 4 times.
More than 4 times. 5 times. Well, 8 to 14 times as much. That's why there is so much interest in looking at economies that are growing fast. Because what is part of that story? What happens if an economy grows fast? What constitutes growth? What constitutes the GDP of an economy, of the country? you remember in economics classes, remember what it means. What is a substantial part? For example, what's the biggest part of the USD? Consumption, right? Consumption is a huge part, right? And so if you happen to be a business and you're interested in looking at where is the market growing, there is a massive difference between a market that's growing at 6% or 8%. And Africa, for example, has been in recent years growing how fast? 5 to 8%, or 6%. Okay? It's a phenomenally high rate of growth.
But does your little formula still hold for Africa? Because doubling something that's not much, which is a few million. It doesn't do much, even if it doubles and triples.
Yes. So you're absolutely right.
It's still not a lot.
It still doubles, but the question is how much, because the base matters, right? How big, by the way, is all of Africa in terms of its gross domestic product?
About 1.5 trillion, maybe about 2 trillion. Well, 1.5 to 2 trillion.
About 1.5.
We don't really know the
Sorry?
exact number, so we don't know the exact number.
It's in the ballpark of about 1.5
But
trillion.
the formula you came up with,
Yeah.
how do you arrive at the formula?
Oh, the doubling formula?
Yeah, how did you get to that formula? Who created it?
It's a rule of thumb, and you can calculate it. You can look at $1 today, right, compound it at X%, and look at how many years it takes for it to become 2X dollars. That's a simple formula that you learn in your basic accounting.
Right.
So the rule that I gave you, which is 72 by the rate of growth, is a very good approximation to that exact formula.
A projection, basically.
It's a projection, that's what it is, right? So you're right, base matters, right? But still, if you are a $1.5 trillion economy, and if you look at India, for example, how big is India? Which is in the news a lot, right?
Population, you mean the population?
No, the
Economic
growth.
growth, okay.
Yeah.
About 4 trillion.
No, in purchasing power parity terms, it is about 4 trillion. In nominal terms, it is a little bit bigger. It's about 1.5 trillion in nominal terms. So there isn't that huge big difference. Of course, in terms of population, what's the difference? So how big is all of Africa?
It's now about 1 billion, 800,000 to 1 billion.
Correct. It's close to about 1 billion now, right? India is 1.3, right? China is about 1.3. No, it's still about 1.3, 1.4. Still not that big. It's slowed down a lot in its growth. And so the point is, when you aggregate all of these different markets, each one of them may be 1/10 the size of the US. It has many more people than the US does. The US is what? How many people?
305 million.
300 something, right? What you find, therefore, is that there is a sizable opportunity in these markets. But given the disparities and given the differences in the per capita incomes of people, the nature of those opportunities is very different. And so I want to ask you, take this little bit of information that I just gave you, and I want to ask you, what opportunities would you see to be different? How would you structure, or how would you think about what are the, if Africa continues to grow at the rate that it does, how many of you are from Africa? Good. How many of you have been to Africa? Everyone. Good. So let's look at this and take that into your own experience. If you are from Africa, what are the changes you've seen in the last 7, 8, 10 years? Tell me where you're from and what changes you've been seeing. What's your name?
My name is Gozi.
Gozi?
I'm from Nigeria.
Nigeria?
And I think by far the biggest growth I've seen in this show is something more
Mobile technology, right? Everyone agree mobile technology is one area, right? What else have you seen?
This is Istanbul, originally from DRC,
Ah,
financial services,
yes.
banking.
Right. Are you seeing substantial changes?
Yes.
What changes?
A lot of things,
Right.
big industries, and people have actually more access to financial services. They can actually go into a bank and get a loan,
Right.
which is something that maybe 10 years ago they might be able to do.
So the availability of financial services,
Yes.
credit, right,
Yes.
is one. What else do you see changing? Yeah.
I think kind of building on what she said, I think there's also been a large change in capital markets on the continent.
Okay. Now tell me what changes in capital markets.
Oh, I think in about 95 there were only about 4 exchanges across the continent, and now there's about 26.
Yes.
So I think that by far just implicitly outlines
Yeah.
change.
I'm Zaza from the Netherlands.
Sorry?
My name is Zaza from
Uh-huh.
the Netherlands.
Yes.
One of the biggest changes I've come across in Africa is the change in industry and construction.
Yeah. So expand on that. What does that mean?
Well, if you compare stories that we heard 30 years ago about doing business in Africa,
Yeah.
the challenges then are different from the challenges now in terms of volume and all that. Also the logistical challenges such that construction will always be one of the foundations of big rising country.
Yeah.
China went through it, India went through it.
Yeah.
And African countries have made significant changes in making logistics work for their country.
How important is the infrastructure growth?
It's the crux of it.
It's a crux of a lot of things, right? Yes.
Michael Robinson from Jamaica and the Caribbean.
Uh-huh.
One change I've seen in Africa and also in the Caribbean is the influence of China in the region.
Good.
Big change.
Why and what is the reason for that?
That's a big question. Well, I guess like China has huge needs, so much of the interest is like to extract resources. So in Jamaica we have bauxite, which makes aluminum. So that they're very involved in extractive industries, and they lend the government a lot of money and tend not to attach as much strings as the U.S. or World Bank would do when they lend money to the government.
Yeah, yeah. And why do you think they do
I won't answer that question.
this? You won't answer that.
Yeah,
but you know the answer. to it.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, they're definitely expanding their influence.
Right.
Where it ends, I don't know, because there have been problems in every place that they've done things.
Yeah.
I mean, and typically when they have big infrastructure projects, they bring in a lot of Chinese workers and so on. And there's always been some tension with the locals.
Yeah.
This happened in my country, so I've seen that as well.
But the presence of China in Africa is nothing new. If you go back 35 years to the Zambian National Railroad, it was built basically funded by China, because I know the former ambassador from the UN offices in Geneva, Isaiah Chubala, and his first international assignment was working on the Zambian National Railroad.
Yeah.
So it's not new, but the shift, I think, is to the extractive industries, yes.
Yeah. Yes. Good.
Just building on what you just mentioned, my name is Carl. I have a little problem in terms of these changes.
Yeah.
Are these changes indigenously triggered, or are they artificial? Because when you talk about changes that we're trying to discuss here, it would be more better for these infrastructures to be actually triggered indigenously, by the people themselves. If they are foreign driven, it might not be good for the continent.
Mm.
So I was wondering, the growth that you mentioned, are they artificial growth,
Yeah.
or are they tangible growth? Are they just statistics? So I'm just concerned as to
Mm-hmm.
the natives' participation in the new emerging market.
Yeah. Okay. You know what I'm going to do is I just remove this because I think we don't need overheads. I did a big presentation to you, but I think we will have a much better time having a discussion. What do you say? That better?
Yes.
Good. In which case, let me just put this away.
You can still use yours. I'm gonna see your opinion as well. What would you?
No, like I said, the real reason for being a professor in a university is that you don't answer any questions.
But you have a template, right?
I will tell you what I think shortly. But let's first deal with what you guys think, right? And what your questions are. Okay. And so he said there is interest from China. The question was, is this good or bad? But let's come back to that. There is growth in industries. We said telecom. What else did you say?
Banking and finance.
Banking, infrastructure, right? What else?
Politics.
Huh?
Politics.
Politics. Tell me about politics.
Transition from dictatorships to more inferior
Would we call them elected governments or not yet? If I insist, right? And just put a label on it. For the sake of discussion, let's assume, right? Yes.
In terms of politics, what I think what is changing quite a bit is the view that the outside world has onto Africa as a continent. In 2005, everyone was telling me for 3 years straight, Africa will never and cannot produce drugs. And I said, look at India, they never had it, and now they're still. Why not? So now there are some, I can tell you, every company on the continent that produces drugs. So people, it's very slowly changing their opinion, and to more realistic.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. So we've laid out 3 dimensions, which is industrial growth, political change, and the interest from outside Africa, possibly in its resources. What are the other key dimensions that you think we need to worry about as people interested in business, right?
population growth.
Yeah. What do we know about population growth?
We know Nigeria is expanding very.
You know, Nigeria is expanding like crazy, right? How big is Nigeria today? 145 million?
150 million.
150 million. And what is the growth rate?
6.6%. Oh, no, the growth rate of population.
Population growth rate.
About 2.3.
About 2.3%. Right? In fact, if you do a graph which looks at the population growth of the entire African continent over time, and you went from 1950 till today, right? What percentage of the world population used to be in Africa, and what is it today? Anyone? Africa used to be about 8%, and it's now 15% of the total population, right? If I do a similar plot which looks at numbers I have are more closer to 1970 and 2010, and for the percentage of world GDP, right? What do you think is the share of world GDP for Africa today versus 1970? 5%? 5%? Going up, down?
It's stagnant. I don't see any.
Almost stagnant at about 2%
It's not stagnant.
of the total world GDP. 2%.
It was 0.8.
right? And so if you look at, there is on the other hand, the growth in GDP more recently is closer to about 6%, as you said. So the bigger picture, at least in terms of the demographics, is a growing population. If the past trends continue, which is expected, the share of population will grow even bigger. And unless this changes substantially, right, larger percentage of the world's population will be consuming less, right? Or at least not much more, right, compared to the rest of the world. That's part one of the picture. On the other hand, you've talked about this and this and this, right, and the possibility of growth. How do we reconcile this? So let's take a step back and ask, when we talk about economic growth and development, what do we mean? What do you mean? Is it a GDP number that matters, or is it something else?
I mean, it needs to be commensurate. You need to see GDP, and then you need to see real development in terms of, earning potential of the people itself, bluntly, and more money.
And so, ultimately, what is it that we choose to achieve? So here's, if you talk to some of the great economists, and one of the important ones was Simon Kuznets, who actually graduated from Columbia, so you're in a good place. Won the Nobel Prize, did some of the first initial work on what development is and what happens to countries as they go from different ones to the next stage of development. What do you think? The first question he asked was, so what is economics? We can calculate GDP. In fact, he's the one who actually proposed the national accounts that we use today. Right? He warned against the idea of having GDP as a measure. But the question was, ultimately, what is it that we wish to achieve? The country wishes to achieve. Some sort of a well-being, right? Right? Something about enabling better consumption and better living, right?
Just allocation of scarce resources. Scarce resources.
Sorry?
Best utilization of scarce resources.
Security.
Secure.
Security.
Education.
Health. Health.
Health. Production.
Which we don't do much of.
Sorry?
I say which Africa doesn't really do much of.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like we consume more than we produce.
Yeah. Africa's manufacturing is actually pretty low.
Yeah.
Agricultural output tends to be about 10% of world output is from Africa, but manufacturing output is actually a lot lower. The key thing is what? What does all this add up to?
Standard of living.
Standard of living information.
What does all of this mean? Ultimately, what's the aim of all this? A transformation, a change in the lives of people, right? Enabled by what?
By the ability, the buying power.
Part of it is, allowing them certain freedoms, economic freedom being one of those, right? Better control over their lives, and he said, if you look at country after country that has grown, and he said this in the 50s, he said, look, there are fundamental things that you can see happening as countries go from a stage of less to more development. What are those changes? You've identified this. Infrastructure is one key change. For obvious reasons, we can see why that matters. Right? What are the other key things you think change as you go through this transition from a less to a more developed society?
Governments.
Hmm?
Governments.
Governance. He calls it openness and increased freedoms. Right? Very commonly. So when you identify dictatorship, almost never in the history of the world has that been the basis for a transition for a large portion of society from a less to a more developed form. You had something there?
Oh, demographics. I was going to say, speaking to the theory of the demographic transition, so as people become more economically stable, and the demographic shift is birth rate shift.
And what is the demographic shift that you see?
I think you see a decline in population as people, as there's more of a workforce that's, I don't know, let's say educated or involved in economic activities. There's a higher opportunity cost for having more children, and at least in some cases, if you look at the income or the substitution affect each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you see population.
Yeah. Yes.
I think that also comes with the.
Think you speak up.
Sorry. I think that also comes with the fact that the healthcare improves, and so you see a longer lifespan of people, and
Yes.
like less infant mortality, for example.
Yes.
So that's kind of like, while population, well, maybe birth rates decline, you do see an increase in other ways.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but when you say the transition from one end to the other, you do assume that there are a lot of other steps that go in there. If I compare, for example, the transition of the Netherlands to, for example, South Africa, we had institutions that facilitated that transition, which gave us incentives for property rights, infrastructure, all this sort of thing.
What kind of institutions?
Well, that's what I was correct to assume. One institution is property, the respect for property. Another one is my own field, respect for law, contract, respect for contract.
Yes. Third very important feature was the emergence and formations of institutions, and typically new forms of institutions. The fourth is the emergence of communications, both internally and greater communication with the rest of the world. But the emergence of communications technology, and very interestingly, transportation and mobility. Okay. If you want to see a society that is moving, there are predictable things that are going to happen. If Africa is going to keep growing at 6%, you can bet your life that it will only happen unless it is entirely due to three countries selling their resources, right? And that's the basis of the growth, which, by the way, is never something that will reach to a large base of the population, right? This is what we call kleptocracies, right? That's the most likely thing to emerge. You're going to see economic growth on a sustained basis, which creates opportunities for businessmen who want to go and do things. You should look for the signs of these 5 things happening. Okay. You should see the development of basic infrastructure. You should see human development, which you identified there. You should see better governance, the emergence, and this is related, the emergence of institutions for governance, right? Improved communications technologies, improved transportation, and then a plethora of things that follow. As growth happens, what are the first 3 things that come out to be in the biggest demand in the society? Energy, right? What else? Food. Education. And
security.
okay.
Housing. Housing.
Housing, definitely housing. So this is very closely linked to, you've all heard of Maslow, right? What did Maslow say? If any of you remember, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, remember that? What did Maslow say? What is the sequence of needs that people have? Obvious once you hear them, but they still are important to recognize. With the very first one are basic needs of food and shelter and clothing and security, right?
It's like social and eventually self-actualization.
And the other extreme is self-actualization, you know. When you've got everything and you're bored out of your mind, you say, let me go actualize myself, right? You've got nothing better to do. You've got tons of money and you don't know what to do with yourself. So there's a very famous thing, you know, this guy used to say, I want to find myself, I have to actualize. And the answer this guy gave him was, stop giving him food for 2 days. He'll find what actualization is. Okay? All of this is relevant if you have your basic needs met. So there's a very predictable sequence in which demand for things grows as economies move from subsistence economies to what is the second step. Okay, I'm going to take you over the map. But when economists talk about development, what are the stages of development? You go from a state of subsistence economies, right, to what?
Capitalism. Is capitalism next?
Capitalism is an economic system, right? But there is what kind of, so you have industrialized societies, right? What comes in between?
Mercantile.
Society. Commercial society, right? And then you have what we're now beginning to see, what are called knowledge economies, where it is less about what you make and more about the ideas, right? And that's what the developed economies are. If each stage of the transition, you can see some very substantial things happening. What happens when you go from subsistence to a commercial economy? As in some parts of the world, including parts of India, we see this. Including parts of Africa, we will see this. Because remember, it's not a homogeneous thing. Africa is a continent. Parts of Africa are ahead of others. South Africa is not the same, and within South Africa, half the population lives a very different way from the other half of the population, right? 25% of the population is unemployed in South Africa, right? It's a different world for them. What happens as you go from a subsistence to a commercial economy?
Demographic change.
Demographic change, what else? What largely is a subsistence economy, first of all?
You now start to use the means of exchange. Subsistence, you don't really need to use money.
Good.
You make scale.
Scale. What do you do in a subsistence economy, first of all?
You make enough to survive.
You make enough to survive. And what is it that you're making?
Food.
Food, agriculture, right? You grow enough, or you hunt, or you do enough so that you're able to just survive. That's what subsistence is. And the exchange that happens is very minimal, right? It's rural. What happens when you become a commercial economy?
Start to produce enough to sell.
Produce extra.
Production increases.
And what do you want in exchange for that?
Money.
Money with which you do what? Buy what? Buy other goods which are not food. You may want to get, what is this? You know, if you go to the poorest places, what is the first thing if they have a little bit of money they want? Go to remote Africa, and if somebody has an extra dollar, the dollar's a lot sometimes, what would they want to buy? The TV. The radio. Right? Electronics, that's what it is today. Right? You want to buy other things. What becomes therefore important is that the central feature is that distinguishes subsistence from commercial economies is what?
Illegal tenders, yes, you can use it to exchange.
This seems so obvious, but the growth of cities, because what is the one thing cities cannot do? They can't grow food, right? Therefore, what do cities have to do? Trade in exchange, right? What kind of things to happen in cities? What kinds of things can therefore emerge from cities? Stores, commercial centers, what else?
Housing.
Housing.
Increase housing.
Right?
Increase population.
Sorry? Import and export. Therefore, if you look at some of the first cities that emerged, where did the cities emerge? Coastal areas. Why? Because it enables trade. Right? So when we talk about the development of infrastructure, right, and governance and institutions, these are very closely tied to the idea of the emergence of city centers, which become the hub of both exchange, right, as well as the development of a whole set of capabilities. And if you therefore look for markets to enter, right, what should you be looking at? If you were looking to do business in an economy that was a commercial economy or moving towards a commercial economy, where would you look? And what kinds of things would you look for as opportunities?
Infrastructure, government, and
all of these things have to be developed, right?
Yes.
That's what happens, right? Okay. What happens when you go from a commercial to an industrial society? Commercial is largely exchange-based, right? What happens in an industrial society?
Factories,
Use their own products, right? What else happens? Jobs.
Standardization.
Standardization. What else?
There's now more concentration
greater specialization.
More concentration within cities, within.
Yes. So what do you tend to see? So in terms of the education and the education institutions, what do you tend to see happen more in industrialized societies as against commercial societies? What do you need?
Workers, skilled labor, specialized.
Tertiary education is far more important than primary education or secondary education. Suddenly the need for having highly skilled people, right, becomes much greater, right? Interesting aside, when do you think education really took off, tertiary education took off in the United States?
In the 1900s.
60s?
Who said in the 50s? Who said the 50s? Why?
That's when most women went to school after the men came back from the war.
So it is. People came back from the war, and you had all these people who needed to have something to do, right? And that is when big land-grant universities were started, and state universities began. And so in the process of industrialization, a base was formed of a very large pool of increasingly highly qualified people, right? So notice that at each stage of growth, you will find different kinds of opportunities. Education is not education, the same education in a subsistence economy versus a commercial economy versus an industrial economy. It evolves to a different stage. You know, these are seem like very obvious things, but when I first came here 30 years ago, I used to puzzle over them and say, why cannot India have all of these things that the United States have? Right? And what eventually is the answer to all of this?
Time.
time, but also a process. You cannot go from being a commercial economy to an advanced industrial economy without having each of these intermediate stages. And the intermediate stages create both opportunities, right, but also demands, right, on a variety of different things, right? And certain things are very, very important to the formation and evolution of economies, right? Okay, so now with this as background.
Sir, I have a question, because when you spoke about the U.S. economy in the 50s and maybe late 40s when they made that big shift,
Yes.
I don't think you can talk about that without like a huge change in public policy, where you probably had about like 6% of the population being college educated and so on, and then you had the GI Bill and so on, where pretty much in 1947, half of every person in college was a veteran. That was it. I mean, and the people who thought it was very controversial. So that's a big.
It's a huge.
A big step. But then people thought that government should do that, and I'm not sure that a major thing like that, people would support that in some markets and some countries right now.
That is the point, that is what institutional development and evolution is about, Michael. That's exactly the point, which is there's a point in time where it becomes necessary to have these changes. And the appropriate form of governance that you need at a certain time may not be the right 5 years later, 10 years before. And that's part of what one needs to recognize in the development of the economy. So with this as background, let's go back and talk about, and I'll sort of start wrapping it down because I know you have a tour to go to and more interesting things to do than sit in a classroom. But we'll try to wrap this up and say, let's go back and say, so what does this tell us about reflecting back on Africa, right? What you were thinking 40 minutes ago, looking forward, and if you want to put some structure on how to look for opportunities for business, how would you go about doing it?
Can I think one of them would be legal reform.
Legal reform.
Yeah, having strong, not just laws that are protective, but also having regulators who are effective in enforcing the rules as they come in.
Yeah. But is that a business opportunity?
It's not really a business opportunity, but it's part of the protection.
Yes.
Otherwise, you have, because we have the system where the process is structured.
Yeah.
It gives them more advantage.
Yeah.
In a less developed system.
Yes.
For example, I'll give you an example. In the US, for example, in mergers, you have what we call poison pill,
right,
which gives you the opportunity to stop a proposed merger or a takeover. You don't have them in developing nations.
Sure.
So for those who are opportune to have this experience,
yes,
they could bring this structure into the developing economy and use that to block a lot of opportunities that will be available to other locals. So I think it's important that you have a very, as a background, legal reforms that will encourage these investments as they come in.
Yes, and that would be part of the change in the governance in the institutions.
Yeah.
That's one of the things you would look for
Right.
when you think about, is this a good place for me to go invest, right? Yes.
I would say invest in manufacturing. It seems like it would provide an opportunity, one, to just provide, for example, I know about Nigeria, and I know that there's a very high level of unemployment, and it would provide not only jobs, but it would also encourage the government to invest in education so people can develop their skill sets so they can obtain jobs.
And what would be the focus of manufacturing? So what kind of manufacturing, and what would be the key factor that you would try to exploit? Not exploit in the sense of a human exploitation, but that you would want to be able to make use of.
I would say natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
I would try to, whatever I would manufacture, something where I can utilize the natural resources that are already there.
Natural resources extraction is one. What else? So there are two kinds of development. Okay? I want you to keep this fact in mind, whatever you think of going forward. There are some countries and economies that have grown because they have resources. That's called resource-based approach. All the oil-rich countries have that. That requires what? The ability for you to have the capital to extract those resources and sell them. And the technology which you can get from outside. Okay? The other kind is called people-rich development, based on the development of human capital. In almost every academic study that's been done on the subject, you find that the sustainable form of growth is invariably which one? People. It is the evolution and growth of capabilities of people that is the key to sustained growth. There is a limit to how much you can grow based on how much you can extract resources. Secondly, extraction of resources by itself does not build capabilities, nor does it guarantee the formation of all of those things we're talking about. That's called shallow form of growth. There's another term for it, shallow growth, which means it is not stable. It can be disturbed very easily. The people-rich form of growth is in fact the way that I would suggest to you that much of the developing world, particularly Africa, needs to look at very carefully. China, for example, has grown how? Which form of growth is it? Resource-based. Is it? People-rich. It is based on the development of human capital. In fact, it is, on the one hand, a very interesting story of how you have a system which is centrally controlled, right? Which has been directing how people, where they work and where production happens, but have been very systematic in developing human capability. Not evenly, highly uneven and highly controversial, right? But that's the form of growth that we want to build. In fact, if you look at what Chinese manufacturing is about, right? They started 30 years ago when the idea, not necessarily of dominating the world in terms of manufacturing, but essentially of saying, how do we transition people who are farmers and live in villages to the next stage that we know has to happen as economic development happens. Why? Because if you look at productivity, right, and that is the heart of what I was trying to get to earlier with you, you've got to ask the question, where is the greatest improvement in productivity possible through manufacturing? If you look at farming, for example, what is it that gives high productivity in farming?
Cash crops.
Cash crops. What else? Machines, industrialization. It is industrialized farming that lifts productivity to high levels. What is the classic situation in Africa or in most developing countries? What is the size of farms?
Small scale.
Is it feasible to move from small farms to industrialized farms as we have in Brazil, which are, acres and acres of land, as far as the eye can see, which are hugely productive but require very few human beings? Not possible, right? In fact, not even desirable until what happens? Until you're able to find a pathway for people to move from farming, right, to some other form of occupation, which is manufacturing or services, typically manufacturing first. What is the key factor in manufacturing?
Transportation.
Sorry?
Transportation.
Transportation, sometimes. Right?
People's mechanization.
Mechanization. But what else?
People.
Skills, right? And energy and the local context. It is not an absolute. We always think about manufacturing as if we want to do world-class manufacturing tomorrow, right? That's not the question. The question is, what is the relative improvement in the efficiency or productivity of manufacturing from where it is today, right, to what it can be in the next stage? You do not have and cannot go from a highly inefficient method of, say, production or assembly, right, to having a world-class level. That's not the approach. You've got to ask what is the next step in this process. And those are the things that you want to do. Okay, so let me sort of pull this back and sort of ask you to summarize. What have we been talking about? We've been all over the map. We have 5 minutes. I want one of you to tell me, what is it that we've been talking about? Or we just had a nice conversation, wasting an hour. It's fine too. As far as I'm concerned, that's okay. It was your hour. I'm fine. Right? What is it that you take away? Tell me. What do you take away? Yes.
From what I'm hearing us say, what I'm hearing you say as well, is that people first and foremost need to be free. They need freedom. They need to be educated. There has to be strong institutions to create what I call constitutional states. Once there are laws in place and those laws are implemented and there are institutions to implement those laws and the people are obeying those laws, those structures could be built. They could move from subsistence farming or production to commercial, to mechanized or industrialized system of production.
Yes.
Building cities and states and whatnot. Technology, communication,
Okay.
and so on and so forth.
So the first thing you got to recognize is, what is the current state of development? Are we looking at subsistence to commercial or commercial to what's called pre-industrial or early industrial stage of development? Which stage are we at? That's the first thing you want to do.
Okay.
What's the second thing? You got to identify what are the associated changes that are likely to result. For example, are you likely to see great growth in cities? In China, for example, the urbanization rate now stands at about 40%, right? In India, the rate of urbanization is 30%. China's urbanization is supposed to go up to 60 to 65% in the next 20 years. India is from 30% supposed to go up to closer to 50% in the next 20 years. You take 20% of India's 1.3 billion, what does that tell you? How is that going to happen? Right? Means the creation of large number of cities. A similar process of evaluation happens when you think about what is going to happen to somebody who's in an early commercial stage to a later stage of commercialization. Right? You can predict virtually, right, where the opportunities are going to lie. Because what happens if cities are created? Where are the first opportunities? Land, first of all. So if you go and look at some of the richest people in the world in the last 20 years, guess what they made money on?
Real estate.
Real estate, because they figured, they knew that this was the first place. Now you will start thinking as being a businessman. If you're able to predict what changes are going to take place, then you're able to say where are the opportunities. And so I'll leave you with that and ask you, try and put these pieces together, try and say what changes can we expect to happen, and then tie them to where you want to invest and how you want to invest. All right? All right. Good. Thank you very much. After in the classroom, that's what you got.
Thank
So
you.
come back to Columbia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Was that an interesting session for everybody?
Regarding the relevance of business schools.
Yes, sure. You want to ask it now? Because you need to go, don't you?
Yeah.
You have to be.
So we'll corner Professor here.
Surely.
So real quickly, we just have 30 minutes left, so we just wanted to break out into sessions for CEPA and the law school for those interested. And then we also wanted to let you know that registration will be opening at Uris Hall right after the tours are over. So we can show you a little bit how to get there and to actually register at Uris Hall. So before we do that, can I see a show of hands, please, for anyone interested in CEPA? CEPA, and then anybody interested in law school? Law school? the CPA students are actually going to break out into the next room, right, Monique, in 104. And the law students, please meet Rachel in the back. She's right there. And so, does everybody know how to get to yours wall, or shall I walk through quickly how to get to yours wall? Everybody's good. We also have some pizza cookies in the back if you're
This session is over, this session is I think we're going to continue topic as issues. Stress and crops and subsistence farming, commercial, mechanized and industrialized method of production. The factors, the demographics, as well as people-based and resource-based promotions, and how this could be translated into emerging markets. When people are educated, the society is properly educated and they're free and independent and they're able to make their own laws and implement their laws and obey their laws, they're able to basically build their societies free from foreign interference. They can really set up their military with their police force and other institutions in the same area. And that is what it is. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for staying with us. The political reporters covered this African Economic Forum at Columbia University. We'll be going to Owens Hall to listen to the keynote speaker, the Central Bank Governor of Nigeria. Sanusi Lamido Sanusi will be speaking around 6:30 to 7 p.m. tonight. It's a very short talk. Thank you so much.